Now, I made a video a few days ago, and thankfully it seems like playing as a ranged rogue has increasingly become more popular, and for good reasons, because the way of the ranger is the true rogue way in my totally not biased opinion. Being a twisting blade rogue is just not cool anymore these days, guys. Come on, you have to get with the times. These days you want to use a bow or a crossbow to destroy everything. In my previous video we focused on the leveling process mostly. Today we're going to focus on how to destroy everything in the end game on World Tier 4. Like I said previously, this build bumps at any stage in the game really, so that is good news. To make sure you get the most out of your ranger build, however, it is important to optimize your loadout, and thankfully it is not that hard to get the most out of your setup, as you will see today, with even just minimal changes to it. Now, in terms of power, in endgame on World Tier 4, the build holds up extremely well. You can pretty much one-shot entire packs quite easily due to shadow imbuement and how penetrating shot works, and since you attack from a distance as a ranger, you can kite as well, so you have a quite safe way to kill things in sticky situations. Versus bosses, elites, or just generally targets with big HP pools, the build works very well as well, due to a variety of insane bonuses that you get from stacking combo points, us pretty much always having vulnerability applied on our enemies, and the crazy poison application thanks to poison imbuement. The general strategy for farming is to just gather groups of mobs as big as possible to then nuke them all out of existence. A quick recap of how the build then technically works is as following. You want to line up whatever you're fighting in a straight line as much as possible. The more mobs and elites that you can gather, the more damage you will deal, and thus generally the faster you will clear everything. Then make sure to build up your combo points using puncture to get that great damage increase for penetrating shots. Now, the ability selection is still pretty much the same as in part 1 of my ranger build video series, so definitely make sure to check that out if you're interested in why I exactly chose these abilities, but also just the basics and everything else you want to know. However, I do want to give you an update on two things. First of all, when you get the Umbros aspect, you definitely want to start using Concealment over Dark Shroud as an ability to put on your hotbar. With Umbros, you can technically have 7 abilities as a ranged rogue instead of just 6, and I will be talking about that in a second when we get to gear. The second update to our abilities is to Death Trap. Now, Death Trap is nice, it stays great in the end game, it lines up everything for you and deals great damage. However, it has a relatively long cooldown, and as your gear starts getting better, you will pretty much nuke everything anyways with your imbued shots. So it is not that necessary anymore. Therefore, I experimented a bunch and tried out Caltrops and Poison Traps mainly as potential substitutes for Death Trap to get some additional utility on abilities that also have shorter cooldowns. Caltrops is pretty good, but out of the two I liked Poison Trap the most. It generally helps out a lot with survivability with how it just knocks everything down, and with it CCing our enemies, it also makes us naturally deal more damage to the targets with the various modifiers in the game for increased damage to CC targets. But it then also has a passive that you can spec into that gives you a chance to fully reduce your cooldowns for your imbuements. And since we are in imbuement oriented build using 2 imbuements, if it procs, it's a pretty big deal. So Poison Trap is a very good alternative to use over Death Trap, and I recommend you to try it out as well. It will always be obviously preference based, but the best thing is probably to try both of them out and see what you personally like the most. Everything else you need to know is in part 1 of my ranger build video series. For those that are currently below level 50 or in World Tier 3, if you want to progress to Tier 4 early on, you can definitely do so. I soloed the capstone for getting to World Tier 4 in the early 60s, for example, with my ranger build, so definitely possible to do so yourself. It is a good build to clear the capstone dungeon even if you're quite underleveled like I was. Just make sure to dodge the attacks of the boss and you're good to go. Damage wise, you have nothing to worry about. You might need to attempt it a few times to learn his mechanics first though, but doing so can give you early access to World Tier 4, and with that better XP and rewards. Then when you're underleveled while farming in World Tier 4, it is no problem either. The build one-shots or makes quick work of everything anyways. I'm like 10 levels lower here than what I'm fighting, and I had a good time farming and just leveling, even though everything else was a much higher level. Remember, like I said, you're a ranger, so you have the ability to kite at all times. As you level up, gear, the aspects on your armor and stats start to matter more and more. So let's go ahead and take a look at what in my opinion is the absolute best way to build your ranged rogue. Now, in my previous video I explained that trick shot aspect is mandatory for this build, absolutely mandatory, there's no way around it. It's what fuels the build. I recommend you to put it on your amulet to get that 50% bonus to your damage. Then offensive aspect aspects, you definitely want the following aspects: Edge Masters, Expectant, and Corruption. These will all significantly boost your damage output, and they are some of the best aspects for a ranged rogue. Especially Edge Masters is huge, as it can increase your damage up to 40% with the two-handed multiplier, so you'll definitely want to place it on your bow or crossbow. Good news is that you can also get these aspects as codex powers, so they are guaranteed legendary drops. Defensive aspects you then definitely want are the following aspects: Might, Disobedience, and Umbros. Might and Disobedience are very easily procced with our setup, as we basic attack all the time to build up our combo points and always hit like dozens of enemies at the same time. And then Umbros is what I was talking about earlier. It grants you Dark Shroud based on lucky hits, and since yet again with Penetrating Shot we hit so many things at all times, we just pretty much have an infinite Dark Shroud generating ability right here. And as you may or may not know, Dark Shroud is one of the best defensive abilities in the game. It will help out tremendously with your survivability. This makes this aspect in particular one of the absolute best aspects that you can get as a ranged rogue. And the earlier you get it, the better. So make sure to keep an eye on it when looting stuff. I've got it a bunch of times so far, so it shouldn't be too hard. For your boots, you don't have many options, so just get Wind Strikers. It's great for additional movement speed since we crit all the time and makes it easier to reposition ourselves. If you're lucky and have gotten the unique Penitent Greaves, that is much better. If you have it, definitely use it. That aspect is crazy good. So those are already 8 aspects out of the 11 potential aspects covered, and in my opinion, the must-haves. If you still need inspiration for other aspects, then Rapid aspect is decent as well. It's nice for basic attack speed increases, which means we build up combo points even faster. Mangler's aspect is also decent, since we have so many ways to apply vulnerability on our enemies anyways, so it gives us some extra CC in our kit, which is nice. But really, outside of the mentioned 8, I would just experiment for yourself to see what you like the most, since there are quite a number of aspects in the game. Now, what type of weapons do you actually want to run as a ranged rogue? For melee weapons, definitely take swords if you loot them and not daggers. Daggers are pretty much useless for us as they give damage to close enemies, while swords have an innate bonus of giving you increased critical strike damage. Critical strike damage is one of the most important stats for us, so swords are much better. That being said, Condemnation is a dagger, and a really good, unique dagger. Just because of the legendary aspect that it has makes it god tier. However, I have personally not gotten it yet, so I cannot showcase it for this video, unfortunately. If you are like me and you have not gotten this unique yet either, definitely just use 2 swords. For your two-handed slot, you want to prioritize using a crossbow over a bow in my opinion. Reason being is that crossbows have an innate bonus of amplifying your damage to vulnerable targets, which is the best stat for my ranged rogue build due to how it scales our damage output. Bows on the other hand have damage to distant enemies, which isn't as good as vulnerable damage. That being said, Skyhunter, the unique bow for rogues, is a pretty decent unique bow if you can get it. It is going to be preference based however, as it doesn't have the best stats, but it has a very good legendary aspect. It guarantees a crit for every first hit against an enemy, and that can obviously really blow up if you're hitting like 100 things at the same time. I actually got it and I'm using it at the moment, so I'm still experimenting regarding that with what I like the most. I do however have it in sacred tier, so that is kinda unfortunate, and therefore might replace it with an ancestral crossbow with higher DPS and better stat rolls when I get that. So as you can see, I'm still experimenting myself, and this is a good moment to say that I will be making another video for max or very high levels where we optimize and min-max everything. Also, other builds and other type of Diablo 4 content is coming as well, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of that, and give the video a like as well. Let's also talk about the stats that you didn't want to use on your gear, and at the same time I'll also show you some of the stuff I've been using. I'm going to rank the potential stats that you can get for set armor piece on the left side of the screen while I evaluate my gear, so you have a reference of how good or bad it is. I think that's probably more interesting than just naming the stats you want to have. That's pretty boring. So let's get going. Okay, so for my bow I have Skyhunter at this moment is what I'm currently running, and yeah, I kind of like Skyhunter, but as you can see it is a sacred bow like I also just said, and it's kind of getting outdated at this point in time, and I'm probably going to replace with an ancestral crossbow. The main issue I have with Skyhunter is it's very good for farming and, you know, just blowing up entire packs, but versus bosses it's pretty weak because because you don't have that vulnerable damage on it, and thus with an Ancestral Crossbow with good stat rolls, that problem is kind of fixed. And an Ancestral Crossbow will also have higher DPS, so in that sense it's probably going to be overall much better. But for now I'm still using Skyhunter until I get a god tier Ancestral Crossbow. Then for my boots I'm actually very happy. Movement speed, dodge chance, energy cost reduction, and movement speed again. These are some of the best stat rolls that you can have on your boots as a rogue. Obviously I would prefer Penitent Greaves, but yeah, I don't have it, so for now these boots definitely hold up well as well. For my pants I'm actually currently experimenting with Temerity, and you might ask, wait, isn't that really dumb because we don't really have a way to heal ourselves? When you're playing like a Twisting Blades rogue, you probably will have invested points into this stat. Where is it? This one, Siphoning Strikes, which heals you all the time essentially. So it's really good for melee type of rogues. And you might say, well, for range rogues it's really bad. But the thing is, I found out that you actually can get that barrier with this thing if you use a potion. Yes, if you use a potion. So if you overheal yourself with a potion, you will proc this thing's effect and you will get that barrier. So it is pretty decent. Sometimes it can also kind of suck at times. But pants with damage reduction and armor and stat rolls like extra dark shards are probably going to be better. And then I can also put Disobedience on it, because at this moment I have no room anymore for Disobedience because I'm using this unique. But at this point in time I'm just still experimenting. So Temerity is pretty decent as well, but otherwise I would definitely just go for a pants with damage reduction, armor, Disobedience, that kind of stuff. My gloves are actually pretty decent. Attack speed, critical strike chance, and the third one is the best. 4 ranks of penetrating shot for free, which makes our penetrating shot now sit at a 9 out of 5. And from what I know, it can get even higher than that, so that is pretty nice. Just is kind of decent. Damage reduction, total armor damage reduction, but the first stat is completely useless, so it can be better, it can be improved, and I already rolled one stat, so I can't re-roll the first stat, but otherwise not too bad. For my helm I have cooldown reduction, maximum life, attack speed, not too bad, definitely not too bad, but can also definitely be better if I get stats like getting life on kill or ranks of poison imbuement. My amulet sucks pretty badly, but yeah, it has ranks of the exploit passive. I still have not gotten an ancestral amulet for some reason. I cannot get any good amulet. My rings aren't that bad either. Vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, critical strike chance, those are some of the best stats you can get for your ring, and yeah, definitely not bad. For my melee weapons, I definitely want to replace them. They are kind of outdated, but the stat rolls on them are not bad. Vulnerable damage, critical strike damage with imbued skills. For this one, for example, I would then replace basic skill damage with something like core skill damage, which will be much more useful. Basic skill damage is pretty much useless because we just use our basic skill pretty much to build up combo points, so we don't need to have its damage increased. Definitely would prefer core skill damage over basic skill damage at any time of any day, really. You want to socket your armor with topazes as they increase your damage reduction when crowd controlled, and you being crowd controlled is really the #1 situation where you will usually take the most damage and thus have the highest chance of dying. Then emeralds for your weapons, which increases the damage against vulnerable enemies and is just good, and skulls for our rings and amulets, as it will give us a nice bit of extra armor. Okay, so regarding the skill tree, last time I really substantiated every single talent, and if you're interested in that, definitely watch the previous video. In this video, I'm going to mostly be focusing on the differences in comparison to last time, because I would say, if I have to make an estimation right here on the spot, that approximately 92.69% is still the same as last time. So in this video, I will be focusing mostly on the differences in comparison to last time. Now, we still take Puncture, obviously, all of it, and our main ability, Penetrating Shot, and its enhancements. I now have a point in Starter Step, which is pretty good because we critically strike enemies all the time with this build, and that movement speed is really nice, as you will see when you play for yourself. It makes your survivability also much better, actually, because you can reposition yourself, you can dodge much easier. Then when we go to here, I have now taken Reactive Defense and Rugged. It's really nice to have that survivability at this point in time, especially Reactive Defense, because it gives us 12% damage reduction when we're inflicted with control impairing effects. And like I just said with the topazes, having this damage reduction when you are crowd controlled is really nice. Now I have one more point to get from the Renowned, so when I get that, I will be spending that last point in this talent as well. Then for the other passives, Weapon Mastery is still the same, Exploit is still the same, Malice is still the same. Concealment is still the same. I have now Poison Trap instead of Death Trap for the earlier mentioned reasons in this video, and then I'm going to spec into countering Poison Trap also for the earlier mentioned reasons. If this talent procs in combat, it's really nice. A full reset on both of our imbuements is huge. Then when we get to the imbuement skills, everything here is pretty much still the same. I took out the points in Shadow Imbuement because it only increases the base damage of the imbuement. It's not that significant, so you can pretty safely take the points out of it and put it somewhere else, which in this case I did, and put the points in things like reactive defense. Now for poison imbuement, I now use blended poison imbuement. Last time I was using mixed poison imbuement, but since our critical strike chance is now much higher and we have much more consistent critical strikes at this point in time, we can proc this talent much more often than last time, and it's definitely nice to have over, I would say, mixed poison imbuement. Then finally we have still 3 points in innervation, we have a point here, and then 3 points in haste, and then also 1 point in impetus, and we still have precision as our key passive. Okay, and then we have the Paragon board. Now for your starting board, I would recommend use either Combat or Ranger as your starting glyph. Ranger is really nice because it gives you damage and a lot of tankiness essentially, and then Combat is really nice because it gives you extra critical strike damage and a way to restore your energy pretty consistently, because it will restore your energy every time you critically strike, and we do critically strike quite often with this build actually, so it is a nice way to maintain our energy levels. Now for the starting board, I just padded out to the right, got the damage nodes and the prime rare node. This is actually a pretty decent node, 20% extra damage if you meet that bonus. Otherwise it's 10% extra damage. Either way, it's really good. Then in the radius of the glyph, I just took the intelligence nodes as much as possible to proc that additional bonus so we can actually restore our energy. After that, I padded out to the left of this board and got the skillful rare node, 20% extra damage yet again, and some more nodes that increase our damage like these 2 magic nodes. And then just padded up to the next board, which is the no witnesses board. Here I took exploit. Exploit is the most important glyph for a rogue. It does 2 things. It increases your vulnerable damage, but more importantly is that additional bonus. Every time you damage an enemy, they become vulnerable with this glyph. So it's an actually insane glyph, and combine it with other things in our build, by the way, like Puncture, the passive from Shadow Imbuement, which also applies vulnerability. Everything together will make it so that the uptime of vulnerability on our enemies is really high, pretty much always active, you can safely say. And so this thing is an absolute must-have, and you want to get it as soon as possible, so that's why it's in the second board. Now to activate it, you need some strength, so I got some strength in the radius of it like this, and I padded afterwards to the left and got some more damage increasing nodes like these 2, and also the rare node, which also increases our damage. It requires some more intelligence, so I'm still working on getting more intelligence to activate it, but it's a really good node as well. And then I padded out to the left some more, went up and got the rare node rune, which increases the damage to healthy enemies as well as our critical strike damage, and then the surrounding nodes do exactly the same thing, so a bunch of extra critical strike damage and damage to healthy enemies. Just a really nice selection of nodes to get. Then I padded out to the left, rotated the next board like this. This is the exploit weakness board, and I got it pretty much because of the legendary node, which is too good again. The exploit weakness node is really nice because it increases our damage against vulnerable targets, and the damage is multiplicative and stacked, so it can ramp up quite significantly. But against things like boss fights, this thing can become very significant and really good as well. Then the other important aspect of this board is obviously the glyph and what we put inside of it. Here's where I put the earlier mentioned ranger glyph. It increases the damage of our marksman skill, so puncture, but more importantly our main ability, penetrating shot. But then it also gives us that 10% reduced damage when wielding a ranged weapon, and as a ranged rogue we are always wielding a ranged weapon obviously, so we have a 10% reduced damage at all times. Then in the radius of the glyph, I just take the things to activate it, so in this case you need 40 dexterity, which is more than the other glyphs, but thankfully there are 2 rare nodes in the proximity of this glyph that give you 10 dexterity, and they're also actually quite good. This one increases the potion healing, so that helps out with our survivability, but this one increases our vulnerable damage with 10%, and then also both of them will increase our marksman skill damage even more. In the radius of the glyph, 2 more important nodes are to get are these 2, both increase our vulnerable damage as well. And in the bottom section of the board, while pathing to the next board, I got some more rare nodes like this one that increases damage to elites, but also the hunter killer rare node, which is quite significant actually, 32% extra damage to elites as well from activating this node. And then some more survivability type of nodes right here that increase our resistances and maximum life. Now Now, I'm still optimizing my Paragon boards and tinkering and experimenting with them, but for now I definitely think these are good Paragon boards that support the build very well, providing you survivability and just overall great damage. You really can't go wrong with them. However, when I unlock the remainder of the boards and really optimize it, it will be a part of the next video about this build. And with that, you now know everything about my ranged rogue for endgame. Stay tuned for the next version of the build that will be completely min-maxed and optimized, but also stay tuned for other Diablo 4 content and builds.